Frédéric Francois Chopin was born in Poland in 1810. He was deemed a prodigy pianist from a young age, and in his early 20s, he integrated himself into Paris's booming art scene. There he accrued a reputation as a brilliant composer which endures to this day. However, Chopin's health was poor throughout much of his life. At the young age of 39, he spent his final days in an apartment at the Place Vendôme. And that is where our story begins. Hello everyone, my name is Delicacy, and this is Video Delicacies, where we seek to taste the greatest flavors that old games have to offer. I just played Eternal Sonata, which was developed by Tri-Crescendo and published by Bandai Namco. It was released for the Microsoft Xbox 360 in 2007, and for the Sony PlayStation 3 in 2008. I was reminded of this game back in episode 4 of this series when I was playing Fragile Dreams, Farewell Ruins of the Moon, another Tri-Crescendo Bandai Namco collaboration that came out a year and a half later. I was extremely curious about Eternal Sonata when it was new, but I've never been an Xbox person, so I was unable to play it. I would have checked it out the following year when the PS3 version dropped, but by that point, someone who I was friends with at the time had played it on 360 and told me that it was disappointing. Now that I'm an adult and susceptible to peer pressure, I decided to play the game myself and form my own opinion. I found a copy of it at my local used game store and played it on a borrowed 360. Eternal Sonata began darkly with a shot of someone falling. From there, it cut to a scene from that person's childhood, where she was walking with her mother through a field of flowers. Her name was Polka. All of the characters and locations in Eternal Sonata drew their names from music terminology. The game then jumped to the present. Polka was trying to earn money by selling floral powder made in her village, but the people of the nearby city were only interested in mineral powder. After witnessing an act of violence, she healed a stranger's wound, but he was frightened of her and ran off thanklessly. In this world, the ability to use magic was a side effect of an incurable and inevitably fatal illness, stigmatized by those who mistakenly believed it to be contagious. I then gained control of Polka as she was returning to her village, Tenuto. During battle, each character, player or foe, would act sequentially in an order determined by the speed stat. The action gauge on the left indicated how much that character was able to do before their turn ended. It would decrease as I moved around using the left analog stick, and also when I tapped the A button to attack. During an opponent's turn, I could press the B button to guard. Just before they struck, there would be an audio cue accompanied by the word "chance" above my character's head. I would then have a brief window to block the hit and take drastically reduced damage. Pressing the button too early would leave my character defenseless, which prevented me from just mashing it. Also, if an enemy ever attacked from behind, there was no opportunity to guard at all, so facing characters in the correct direction was important. Polka's weapon was an umbrella, and I'm a big fan of that. After Polka made it home, the game shifted perspective back to the city. There, a pair of thieves were stealing bread from a bakery. One of them was named Reto, short for Allegretto. Reto's smaller accomplice was named Beat. I was then able to explore a little as these two. The environments in this game were all breathtaking to look at, but I want to specifically point out how decadent the interiors were. The player will only enter this pharmacy long enough to talk to the one NPC there, but there's nonetheless so much to look at. Reto and Beat had undertaken the noble task of delivering food to children who couldn't afford it. These kids were on the other side of a rodent-infested sewer, a classic choice for the game's first dungeon. This is where I was introduced to one of the more unique aspects of Eternal Sonata's battle system. I could press the Y button to perform a special attack. Each character had 2 different specials, and which one I was able to use was determined by whether they were standing in the dark or in the light. Different arenas had their own arrangements of light and darkness, and these were often dynamic. For example, taller enemies cast shadows that were large enough to stand in, and this fluorite mouse had a glowing tail which gave off light around it. Beat had one of the more interesting specials in the game. While in the light, he could use Vivid Shot to pull out a camera. Until the action gauge ran out, I was then able to aim and shoot photos. After waiting for them to develop, I could sell these photos at any shop for cash. Photography is such a cute way to have a thief character. It's functionally similar to stealing items in a Final Fantasy, but it's presented in this totally novel way. I love it. I was able to press X to use items. These needed to be allotted from the menu, and there was a point system determining how many I could have. This limitation spared me from scrolling through the entire inventory during battle. As Reto delivered the bread, Beat wondered why the baker couldn't make it cheap enough for everyone to afford. Reto explained that it was because Waltz, the Count of Forte, imposed high taxes on all products, with the conspicuous exception of mineral powder. I was surprised that Reto is the brains of the pair. I had expected Beat to be a Tails-type sidekick. That night, as the opening credits played, Beat struggled to see the stars through the city lights. Meanwhile, Polka was watching those same city lights from the starlit hills above. Here she met the actual, literal Frédéric François Chopin. He explained that this entire world was a dream that he was having from his deathbed in Paris. But Polka didn't believe him. She asked him to prove that she was part of his imagination by telling her what she was thinking. Both of their dark specials were attacks, and both of their light specials were healing. Frédéric's sacred signature restored less than Polka's orange glow, but it was shorter so it could be used more times per turn. There was no MP in Eternal Sonata. The only resource required for specials was the action gauge, so I essentially had access to unlimited healing. Frédéric's weapon was a baton, with which he did fun little conducting poses. I don't believe the historical Chopin was a conductor, but it was cute regardless. I noticed here that the status page listed the characters' ages. Polka was 14, which sounded about right, but I couldn't believe it when I saw Frédéric's age listed as 39. I had fully assumed that Eternal Sonata was taking creative liberties by depicting Chopin as a teen here. But no, he had the actual age from when he died in real life. This pretty anime boy is older than I am. Polka led Frédéric through the woods to show him some special flowers, which absorbed sunlight and released it at night. Because they only bloomed in the darkness, people considered them a bad omen. Polka said that she related to these flowers. She then revealed that Frédéric had not read her mind earlier. What she was actually thinking about was going to Forte Castle to speak to Count Waltz. Her village was suffering because of his tax on the floral powder that they exported. Frédéric seemed intrigued by Polka, not just because of the mind-reading thing, but because she, like him, was terminally ill, and she was intent on using the time she had left to help people. Now that the two parties' goals were aligned, it was inevitable that they would collide. Eternal Sonata's North American release included both English and Japanese voice tracks, and both featured a number of well-known performers.
Oh, I guess I took longer than usual. Mom's probably worried about me. I'd better get home before it gets dark.
Polka's English voice was provided by Aaron Fitzgerald, who also voiced Ion in Tales of the Abyss. Fitzgerald later went on to voice Quark in Virtue's Last Reward, Bullet in BlazBlue, and probably most notably, Chie from Persona 4, who they took over voicing, beginning with the Vita game.
私、病気で死ぬのが怖いわけじゃないの。ただ、みんなと仲良くできないことが悲しくて。
In Japanese, Polka was voiced by Aya Hirano. Hirano was, of course, the biggest star in the anime industry at the time, having recently voiced characters like Haruhi Suzumiya and Misa Amane. I honestly can't believe they got her. The next stretch took place in the Agogo Forest, with the perspective alternating between Reto and Polka. While the two passed through many of the same places, Polka did so during the rain, while Reto did so in the sun. I really like how this visually distinguished the two trips, but it would have been cool if there had also been some chests that were only accessible in certain weather. There is a system in Eternal Sonata called Party Level, in which the rules of combat were occasionally revised after defeating a major boss. For beating the Forest Boar, my party level rose to 2, which meant that time would no longer pause mid-turn. Once I started moving a character, the action gauge would continue depleting until it was empty, even if I stood still. There were some tricks to making the most of these 5-second turns. Normal attacks could be cancelled into special attacks. Also, special attacks that were started before time expired would continue to play out even after the gauge was empty. While raising the party level made combat more technical, it also came with rewards. Performing combos would now accumulate a currency called Echoes, shown in the bottom right. Using a special consumed all Echoes, making it more powerful based on the amounts. This offered even more incentive to start the turn with normals and finish with a special. Echoes were shared across characters. It was possible to end a turn without spending them, thereby enabling the next character to perform an even bigger special. At the end of a Go-Go Forest was a Go-Go Village. The two parties met up there, and upon realizing that they were going to the same place for the same reason, decided to travel together. So prior to playing this game, I had assumed that Frederick was the main character. After all, most of the reason to tell an isekai story is to have a character from Earth to represent the perspective of the audience. When I started playing, though, I was thrilled to be controlling Polka instead. It's so rare that a game lets me play as such a cute character, so I was dismayed at this point when the game put me in control of Reto. Even after I took him out of my battle party, I was still forced to play as him on the overworld. Despite this disappointment, I was encouraged to keep playing by how gorgeous this area was. I'm a huge fan of fixed cameras in games. The way that this low angle emphasized the openness of the space was fantastic. It really felt like I was at the start of a journey. It wasn't long before the party recruited their fifth member, a shepherd named Viola. Her goats were being attacked by monsters, and the others helped her protect them. She explained that the monsters were people who had used mineral powder for too long. It was kind of unclear whether they were humans who turned into evil crow people, or if they were always crow people and they just became evil, but I never saw any animal people who weren't evil monsters, so I assume the former. The next step on the group's journey was passing through a dungeon called Fort Fermata. The game's pace had been extremely breezy up until this point, but here it slammed the brakes. The fort's layout was circular, and pressing switches would rotate the lower level while the upper level remained still. I appreciate when RPGs put puzzles in their dungeons, but I found this particular one more frustrating than anything. Viola was an archer, and her attack took some getting used to. In Melee, she functioned like any other character, able to just mash the button to do a string of hits. At range though, I needed to hold the button to aim and release to fire. Her arrows hit hard, and they dealt more damage the further she was from the targets, but they were poor at accumulating echoes because they were slow, so the question of what distance to position her at was pretty interesting. Initially, her dark special was a short-range attack and her light special was a long-range one. However, characters learned new specials as they leveled up, and while here, Viola got a new light special called Heal Arrow. My first time trying it out was against the dungeon's boss, and I was thoroughly impressed. It healed the entire party and had unlimited range. Viola was both my best healer and my best attacker, and thanks to the way this game worked, she could do both in the same turn. From there, it was a short walk to Castle Forte. The group approached the gates to request an audience with Count Waltz, but they were stopped by a line of cops, whose leader was named Tuba. It was kind of off-putting fighting another person when until now I had been battling monsters, but it was a straightforward boss fight. I kept Polka and Frederick in the shade to deal damage, and put Viola in the sun for healing. Although I was victorious, this went unnoticed by the narrative and the group was thrown into a jail cell. However, that wasn't much of an obstacle for Reto, who was easily able to pick the lock. It was here in the Count's dungeon that the party found their sixth member, their cellmate Salsa. Salsa was 8 years old, the same as Beat, so if you've ever wanted to have an RPG party where 2/3 of the members are Rugrats, Eternal Sonata lets you do that. The group discovered a mysterious hole, which connected to a network of caverns. This was kind of a troublesome area because the walkways were narrow, making combat encounters largely unavoidable. That wasn't inherently an issue, but there were many branching paths, and exploring all of them necessitated a lot of backtracking, meaning that I was fighting each group of monsters multiple times. Eternal Sonata's battle system is fun, but it's not snappy like traditional Dragon Quest style combat, so it became tedious whenever there was a lot at once. Fortunately, most locations didn't have this issue. When they finally emerged from the cave, they ran into the leaders of a rebel group called Andantino. These new characters were named Falsetto, Jazz, and Claves. I adore the fashion in this game. I think that the character designs by artist Kumiko Yoshioka were the best part of Eternal Sonata for me. These were the ones responsible for digging that hole in the Count's dungeon. It turned out that they had been planning to use it to break in, but the party ended up using it to break out instead. Furthermore, the reason the party was arrested in the first place was because Tuba had mistaken them for Andantino. The two groups exchanged what they knew, piecing together that Count Waltz was using mineral powder to turn his subjects into soldiers for use against a foreign enemy called Baroque. While they chatted, Tuba caught up to them. This was a little more challenging than my previous battle against him because the game forced Beat into my party. Inactive characters continued to gain experience. though at a slower rate than those participating in combat, so Beat was a couple of levels behind the others. Another thing differentiating this fight was that it took place in broad daylight, with the only shade being from clouds which moved overhead unpredictably. After he was defeated, Tuba smashed the precarious bridge underfoot, sending everyone into the rushing waters below. Eternal Sonata was divided into 8 chapters, each named for works composed by Chopin. The first had been titled Raindrops after one of his preludes, and the second was called Revolution after his revolutionary etude, which you're hearing right now. This piece was my introduction to Chopin by way of the Bamani song Kakme. The first 6 of these chapters included an interlude which delivered biographical information over a slideshow while the chapter's namesake score played. Despite the abundance of voice acting in this game, these were not narrated, presumably to not distract from the music. You might expect Eternal Sonata's soundtrack to be entirely Chopin arrangements, but outside of these interludes, it consisted predominantly of original compositions by Motoi Sakuraba. Sakuraba is one of the most recognizable names in video game music, and at the time he was probably best known for his work on the Tales series. Of the Sakuraba soundtracks with which I'm familiar, I'd say that my favorite is Valkyrie Profile, but Eternal Sonata is definitely one of the better ones. While not always Chopin-specific, the theme of music pervaded this game. There were items called score pieces to be found, sometimes in chests, but often in less obvious places. There were also NPCs throughout the world who had score pieces of their own, and by talking to them I could request a session where we played our pieces together. Most of the combinations were not good. If I correctly chose a piece that corresponded to theirs, I would be rewarded with an item, and some pieces had multiple possible matches. This system was a cute way of letting the player feel a little like a composer themselves. Everyone was split up after falling into the river. Chapter 3 followed Reto's party, which included Viola and the Andantino trio, while Chapter 4 caught up with Polka's group of Frederick, Beat, and Salsa. Each party traversed a handful of locations, but I want to specifically call out Lento Cemetery, since this was my favorite dungeon in the game. There were these chromatic doors that required flames of specific colors to open. For example, a blue flame could open a blue door, but a blue flame and a red flame were required to open a magenta door. As a sicko who loves the Cloisters of Trials from Final Fantasy X, I was in my element here. Getting the final chest took some real cleverness, but doing so rewarded Reto with a very powerful sword. Of the 3 Andantino characters, Falsetto was the one who I used the most. She fought with her fists, meaning that her attacks would whiff if I didn't move her right up next to the enemy, but she was a strong fighter. She also had some wild voice lines.
If you strike a stone, rocks are scattered. If you strike a person, the soul is scattered. Death to both! Shadow Beam!
As the group was traveling, Jazz became aware that there was a leak among his confidants, and he immediately suspected Falsetto. Maybe it had something to do with her name. In actuality, the spy was Claves. Claves, however, had fallen in love with Jazz, and she was jealous that Falsetto was close to him. But when the opportunity arose for Claves to confirm Jazz's suspicions, she instead talked him out of them, sacrificing both her mission and her romance to do the right thing. She died for this choice, killed by another of Count Waltz's agents. I liked these 3 characters and their relationships, but this whole plotline happened very quickly. I wouldn't have minded this being a larger part of the game. Meanwhile, Polka's party had been rescued by a riverboat bound for Baroque. Baroque was a snowy kingdom with a distinctive visual style and color palette that I found really pleasing. While the ship voyaged downriver, it was rammed by a pirate vessel. Rather than wait to be boarded, the party took the initiative and boarded them first. This led to a fun, but somewhat disorienting dungeon that involved traveling up and down across 4 similar-looking decks of the ship. This was my first time using Salsa in my party. Her weapon was a pair of bracelets that quickly accumulated echoes with the rapid hits. This area's boss was a pretty pirate captain named Dolce. She was an extremely minor character, but her fun design and animations made her very memorable for me. She was also the most challenging boss that I'd fought in a while, since I didn't have access to Viola's heal arrow. It took most of my allotted items, but I was able to narrowly survive. The ship then arrived in Baroque's capital, where the party met with Prince Crescendo and his fiancée, Princess Serenade. I only played the Xbox 360 version of the game, but apparently Crescendo and Serenade were both made playable in the later PS3 release. The two of them were worried about Forte's growing military. Crescendo had been plotting with Andantino to assassinate Count Waltz, but Serenade believed that this would not prevent the oncoming war, and so she talked him out of it. The two asked the party to deliver the message to Jazz that Andantino no longer had Baroque's support. So, I love role-playing games. For a large part of my life, they represented the majority of video games that I played, and I still enjoy them now when I can find the time. So it might surprise you that I'm not a fan of one of their most ubiquitous conventions, the experience point. The ambiguity of how many battles I'm intended to be fighting versus running from often stresses me out. I feel like if I'm over-leveled, then I'm not really engaging with the game anymore. There are a number of ways that an RPG could address this, though my favorite solution that I've seen is Chrono Crosses. In that game, fighting raises characters' stats directly, sort of like in the Saga series. However, those stats have a cap which only rises upon defeating bosses. That means that normal battles still feel rewarding, but the player ultimately can't stray too far from the stats that the game expects them to have at any given point in the story. I've always been surprised that the system was never widely adopted. Instead, in the years since Chrono Cross, experience points have gone on to become ubiquitous in other genres as well. Perhaps my anxieties are just not that common. I've never seen Eternal Sonata's game over screen. I completed it without losing a single battle. And, you know, maybe it's just an easy game, nothing wrong with that. But I can't shake this feeling that maybe there was some deeper challenge here that I inadvertently cheated myself out of somehow. There was one more dungeon before the party was fully reunited. Neither Polka nor Reto were present for this one, so the game gave me control of beats. This was the first time that I had access to the final playable character, Salsa's twin sister March. That's right, the all-Rugrat lineup was possible. March was a support character who could give defense buffs to herself and allies, and she could also immobilize enemies. By this point, I had reached party level 4, which unlocked a couple of new mechanics. While under attack, there was now a chance that instead of being given a window to press the B button to guard, I would instead be given the opportunity to press the A button to counterattack. There was a different audio cue to help distinguish the two. If I pressed A with proper timing, it would give the remainder of the enemy's action gauge to my character. This was a powerful boon when I pulled it off, but having to monitor for 2 prompts instead of 1 made opponents' turns more challenging. The other new system was called Harmony Chains. If I used a special with 24 or more echoes, I could perform a second special immediately after it, even if the action gauge was depleted, though it did require a properly timed press of the Y button. Later on, I would unlock the ability to do harmony chains with 3 specials and multiple characters. One system that I haven't mentioned much so far is equipment, and that's because the game didn't do much with it. I found new weapons and armor regularly, but they were mostly just linear upgrades. There were at least a handful of interesting accessories. For example, the speed shoes increased a character's movement rate, which was useful since turns were limited on time. And the brilliant brooch created illumination around its wearer, guaranteeing that they and anyone adjacent could always use their light specials. Eventually, everyone reconverged in Baroque. That is, everyone except Falsetto, who was hit hard by Clavese's sudden passing. While Jazz was awaiting an audience with the prince, the group was attacked by Rondo, Clavese's killer. Falsetto dramatically reappeared and a boss fight commenced. Falsetto forcibly replaced Viola in my party, but that was okay, because Frederick had become a formidable replacement. He learned a second healing special which could be harmony chained with his first one, enabling a lot of recovery in one turn. Rondo was defeated, and Jazz welcomed Falsetto back. You might think that this was the end of the love triangle, but no, Viola stepped in to take Clavese's place. Am I the only adult woman around here who doesn't find this guy irresistible? For the first time, I now had access to all 9 playable characters. My main party for the rest of the game was Polka, Falsetto, and Viola, though I did at one point swap in Beat to snap some photos. When they returned to Baroque Castle, the group discovered that the prince and princess had gone missing. Crescendo and Serenade were planning to surrender themselves as prisoners to Count Waltz in a last-ditch attempt to convince him to curtail his war effort. This was an obviously bad plan, so the heroes gave chase. They caught up to them at the border between Baroque and Forte. Everyone tried to convince Crescendo and Serenade that sacrificing themselves would not prevent Forte's invasion and was, if anything, likely to hasten it. But when Count Waltz arrived, they offered themselves anyway. Waltz wasn't interested though. Instead, he wanted Polka. He believed that her magic was the key to creating more potent mineral powder and therefore more powerful monsters, a hypothesis that his Chancellor Legato surreptitiously tested as they negotiated. Polka had left her home village in search of a way to help people. If going with Waltz meant that there would be peace between the two kingdoms, then it seemed like she had found what she sought. But she was naive. When she surrendered, Waltz knocked her out, and then he attacked the rest of the group. As the battle started, Waltz was accompanied by his steed, but it had far fewer HP than he did, so it was quickly narrowed down to a 3v1. Though Waltz was fast, he took so many turns that he barely seemed outnumbered at all. This was probably the single most difficult boss for me, but with Frederick and Viola's combined healing efforts, I was able to pull through. The villain was defeated, but the story was far from over. Legato desperately quaffed the mineral powder from his little experiment, transforming him into a terrifying beast. His power was so great that he tore a hole in space and disappeared through it. After dusting themselves off, the party followed, and that's when things started to get more abstract. Let's talk about the boxes of Eternal Sonata. I'll begin with the North American 360 version, as that's the one that I played. And it's beautiful. This is the image that made me want to play this game nearly 20 years ago, and it hasn't left my brain since. The colors are fantastic, with Polka's primary red juxtaposed against the primary greens and blues of the background. This is the exact approach that the Xenoblade cover arts use, and that's because it looks great. I also find the image of Frederick playing a piano out in the middle of this field to be really striking. We'll see this concept revisited in the game's credits. The PAL box is the same as the NA one, so let's move on to Japan's cover. There the game was titled Trusty Bell Chopin no Yume. I'm fond of both titles. Eternal Sonata is more descriptive, but Trusty Bell is more fun to say. The art is pretty, but it doesn't show off the character designs as well, and also the music motif isn't represented here at all, except by the word Chopin appearing in the subtitle. Now on to the PlayStation 3 boxes. The NA and PAL ones differ this time, but they both use the same renders of the characters. Notably, Crescendo and Serenade are here to highlight that they're playable in this release. I don't care for either of these boxes. Finally, here's the JP PS3 box. It's pretty good. Unlike the other regions, I think Japan's box got upgraded when it went to PS3. The arrangement of the characters is similar to the overseas 360 box, but I think that the posing is less effective here, particularly for Frederick, who's lost his piano. And once again, there's no real representation of music. The score behind the logo that all of the Western boxes have would have gone a long way for me here. So after looking at all of these boxes, the first one remains my favorites. Though, what if I told you that it could have been even lovelier? Well, there exists a version of this art that uses hand-drawn versions of the characters. Look at Beat's expression. Look at the folds in Polka's skirt. I still love the version with the renders, but this one feels so much more alive. Beyond Legato's Rift was a place called the Elegy of the Moon. The souls of people turned into monsters were unable to pass on to the afterlife, and so they lingered here in this limbo. Like so many of Eternal Sonata's vistas, it was gorgeous. This realm was home to the game's last two dungeons. Xylophone Tower of the Shining Keys had a music gimmick. On several of the floors, I needed to memorize a series of notes and then play them back on an oversized keyboard. I cheated by simply writing the sequence down. Sadly, I am not a musician. After that was the Double Reed Tower of Sand. Here I needed to take to task a series of earlier bosses. Naturally, they were stronger this time, but so was my party. I really appreciated how much the combat evolved as I progressed through Eternal Sonata. My game plan by this point revolved entirely around accumulating echoes to do huge harmony chains, which were not even a thing until over halfway through the game. After each refight, there was a short scene where Frederick conversed with other characters in a black void. He talked to Falsetto and Jazz about the distinction between dreams and reality. He talked to Viola and the twins about mortality. He talked to Claves about how art outlives the artist. And finally, he talked to Polka, Reto, and Beat about the relationship between reality and art. Once all of the game's themes had been thoroughly laid bare, it was time to confront Legato. During the refights, Polka had finally learned Blossom Shower, her full party healing special. Unlike Waltz, Legato was only fast enough to take one turn per rotation. There was mathematically no way he could keep up with Polka and Viola's healing. My party was invincible. After I brought down Legato, Frederick stepped through a dark portal onto an arid field surrounded by bone-like monuments. His time was up, and he needed to accept his fate. But first he needed to free himself from his attachment to this dream, and to do that, he needed to prove to himself that the people he cared about were not real. Before, I said that this game's music was mostly original, and here's the exception to that. Yes, the final battle theme was an arrangement of the Revolutionary Etude. It was extremely sick. And while the music and the drama were intense, the battle itself was just slightly more difficult than the one before it. My party was able to defeat Frederick using only a couple of items. So what happened next is going to be kind of hard to explain. Basically, there had been some mysterious occurrences throughout the game hinting that Polka was in a kind of time loop, but that she had repressed her memories of the previous cycles. Here, at the end of the world, she finally remembered. She leapt from the cliff and was reborn as a child. Everything began anew, just as I had seen happen at the very start of the game. Back in Paris, in our world, Frédéric François Chopin was pronounced dead by his doctor as the clock struck 2 a.m. on October 17, 1849. But somehow, his voice reached Polka. There was still time to save her. Polka, now 14 years old again, rose Christ-like up to the cliff where she had left her friends. The desolate world of Frederick's reality gave way to the colorful world of dreams once again. Polka and Reto embraced, and I started crying. Completing Eternal Sonata took me 23 hours and 31 minutes. By the standards of the genre, that's pretty short, which suits me fine. In fact, one of the reasons I played the 360 version was that the PS3 one was several hours longer. I loved my time with Eternal Sonata. I deeply admire the boldness required to create a story about a real historical person and make it this fanciful and stylish. And at the same time, there's a great deal of restraint shown here. I can imagine a version of this game where, like, the villain is Mozart or something, and that would have been worse. The Eternal Sonata that we got had the proper balance. I suppose that I have some regret about not playing this game back in the day, but the thing about old video games is that most of them are still around. You can just play them, it's great. I like to close each episode of Video Delicacies by ranking the game that I've just played against all of the ones before it. So how does Eternal Sonata stack up against the 12 games that I played in Season 1? Well, in terms of visuals, I think it beats them all. That's a slightly unfair comparison because it was working with more powerful hardware, but I think this art direction and these character designs could have made for a beautiful game on any platform, so I'm tempted to grant it a high placement. But when I compare Eternal Sonata to Black Rock Shooter the game, I think I prefer that one's take on this sort of semi-real-time RPG combat. So the highest I can put Eternal Sonata is at number 6, just below Black Rock Shooter the game, and above Spyro the Dragon. Thank you so much for watching. I sincerely hope that you enjoyed this episode of Video Delicacies. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you'd press the like button or leave a comment before you go. I'd also encourage you to check out my other videos, as I've made 13 of these now, and if you like this one, I think you'll probably like the others too. If you've already seen multiple episodes, then please consider supporting this series on Patreon. It really does help me out, and you could see your name listed right here in future videos. To those of you who have already signed up, I appreciate you coming along with me on this journey. Next time, I'm going to be playing a game that was released in 2015, my most recent so far. I hope to see you back here in a few weeks with that one. Until then, sweet dreams.